first, the moves today, what a time for CERAWeek to take place. I mean, this is probably a historic conference. Is that all anyone is talking about, the war and the impact on energy markets?
Well, there are two levels of the conference, if you like. They're the presentations. You can hear one right behind me. The conversations are about Iran, but they're also about energy more generally. There are lots of elements of this conference behind the scenes, away from the podium. That's really all anybody, wants to talk about at the moment. It's extraordinary volatility, as you say, and uncertainty. And we've seen these massive price moves today, and it's still not clear when the Strait of Hormuz will reopen to regular tanker traffic.
One of the things we think about too, Simon, is just how much, major executives, major companies are kind of looking through the war, even though we are not quite sure what the timeline still is and which headlines to basically believe. But having said that, there is destruction in the region. We know that. We've talked a lot about Qatar and their LNG, and that's going to take 3 to 5 years to rebuild. So is there some understanding that we're going to have a different floor, perhaps, under energy markets for a while just because of the build back?
I think that's quite right. It's a very important point, and I think we heard, for example, from Mike Wirth earlier, saying that in many respects he doesn't see the futures market, the oil futures market, fully pricing in the physical disruption we've seen. What we're also starting to hear from some executives here is that this disruption will last a long time. In some senses, it might even be kind of permanent. We saw that dramatic attack last week on Qatari facilities. The Qatar Energy said that damage could take up to 5 years to repair. And even sort of beyond that, we've now seen something that has never happened before, which is the effective closure of the Strait of Hormuz. Mm-hmm. And so henceforth, going into the future, that's always going to be a possibility. Previously, it was always theoretical. Now we know it can be done. And it's always going to be a threat that hangs over the region, possibly to some degree, unless we see radical change in Iran.
Why is that such a difficult, and look, this is literally the $1 trillion question, but why is that such a difficult waterway, given the value of what moves through it, given the power of the militaries that want to see safe passage for ships? Why is it so difficult to control that waterway, to make it safe?
It's a hostage to geography. If you look at the topography, if you look at the Iranian coastline, the proximity, the narrowness of the strait and the proximity of Iran to that waterway, it's effectively at the mercy of Iran. And absent, as I say, a complete political change in Iran, ultimately Iran's got the say here. It has the leverage. And until it backs down or agrees to no longer interfere and try and control traffic through the strait, the options are limited. And that's why we are seeing speculation about US military action, boots on the ground. And this is deep concern to the energy industry because it has, as I say, torn up the rule book. Beforehand, this was just a theoretical idea that perhaps this could happen. It is now happening, and we are seeing history in real time.
Well, on that, Simon, speaking of history in real time, CBS reporting just about a half hour ago that some U.S. officials estimate that at least a dozen Iranian mines are situated underwater through the Strait of Hormuz. Again, this is according to CBS. The organization cites another U.S. official as saying the count was less than a dozen. I imagine that makes it more difficult if there were some agreement reached to actually just open it right up.
Yes. Well, that's right. It's not going to be immediate. Even if it happens later today and both sides say reach a deal, it's going to be weeks at least before things could maybe resume some sort of normality. As you say, if those mines really are there, there's got to be a demining exercise. There's got to be some guarantees for ship owners. Look, we have scores of tankers in the Persian Gulf not moving through. And there's been concern that they can't get insurance. The reality is they can get insurance. What's happening is the ship owners are choosing not to take the risk at all. Wow. The risk of attack is real, and we've seen multiple attacks since the beginning of this war.
I love you had a story out basically tracking what's going on at CERAWeek, and you mentioned Dan Yergin, who's so well known, of course, to the energy industry and obviously key at this event. But something he said, I guess, last week, that the first act was the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Now we're in Act 2 of the return of energy security. And I do think about, Simon, or how should we be thinking about, we as someone who covers the energy markets, you too, and then I think about the investing audience, that are we once again now thinking that each country has to be thinking about their energy security and what that means in terms of their own domestic production or their alliances, because these are two big events that have certainly roiled the energy markets over the last few years.
No, absolutely right. I mean, Dan said that in the context of, we've called this before the energy trilemma in previous years here at CERAWeek in Houston, which is this idea there are three sort of considerations. There's the energy transition, how do we get to a cleaner future? Then there's affordability, how do we make energy cheap and plentiful for people around the world? And then there's energy security, and how do you juggle these three things? During COVID, that seemed like a good way of looking at the market. Certainly since the invasion of Ukraine, and now, as of the last few weeks, energy security trumps everything. You've got to keep the lights on. And what we've seen recently, I think, is driving conversations right now, probably in every government, literally around the world, to varying degrees. How do we ensure that we are not exposed by any big future geopolitical upheaval?
Yeah, and just as we think about just 2026 alone with Venezuela and then now this, it's hard not to kind of focus on that. Hey, Simon, just one last question. This is several days where it's all about the global energy markets. What are you listening out for? What are you maybe looking forward to? Is there a speaker or individual in particular that you think is key, and certainly someone that we should pay attention to?
Well, we have a lot of other CEOs coming up. It's a long list of. We're hearing from the CEO of Shell, for example, later on. We've got other interviews here on Bloomberg television. One thing I would say as well, as much as Iran dominates, you just mentioned Venezuela there, we're going to hear from various people on Venezuela over the next few days. That's a huge interest to the energy market, particularly as it promises potentially greater supply in the next few years. And the other big theme here, which is almost getting kind of lost here today, but it hasn't gone away either, is the challenge of powering the AI boom. A lot of discussion here, a lot of really sort of quite involved debate about the complicated challenges there. So that's going to play out through the rest of this week here in Houston.